He is J.P. Morgan, a towering figure standing at 6 feet and 9 inches, with a penetrating gaze and a nose ravaged by a disease at the beginning of the 20th century. He is the most powerful banker in America. He saved the American economy from collapse twice, and from his bank, two of the world's largest banks were born: J.P. Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley. John Pierpont Morgan, known as J.P., was born on April 17, 1837 in Hartford, a small town in Connecticut. His father, John Spencer Morgan, was a wealthy businessman from a wealthy family. Julius inherited a great wealth and was a partner in one of the largest stores in Boston. Julius Morgan had a strong influence on JP's career, especially in the early years. It was his father who, after studying in Boston and Germany, found him a job in 1857 at a branch of the London Bank in New York, of which he was a partner, thanks to his father's help, but also obviously to his abilities. In a short time, JP began to make acquaintances in the Wall Street environment. Among the various friendships he formed during this period was one with Charles Dabney. Dabney was a partner and accountant at the same bank where young JP worked. Meanwhile, in 1864, Julius Morgan became the president of the parent company, the London Bank Peabody & Co., and renamed it Junius Spencer Morgan & Co. In the same year, J.P. Morgan and Dabney founded Dabney Morgan & Co. The new company focuses on foreign currency affairs and especially on the buying and selling of stocks, activities that we would associate today with a modern investment bank. In addition, the two help JP's father manage his capital in the United States. In practice, they are investment consultants for Julius Morgan in America. J.P. Morgan is taking his first steps, beginning to understand how the world works and knows how to do this job. A little curiosity: before closing the most delicate deals, JP would play solitaire while thinking about how to make the deal as convenient as possible, a sort of moment of meditation. In these years, Dabney Morgan & Co. has a moderate success in the financial world, but does not reach the levels of the big Wall Street firms. After a few years of hard work, at the age of 33, JP is already thinking about retirement, having enough money to live his life in peace without having to work. We had seen something similar with Giannini, but John Hughes Morgan does not agree, and in 1871, he introduces him to one of the most important bankers of the time, Anthony Drexel. Urged on by his father, JP becomes junior partner of Anthony Drexel, and together they found Drexel Morgan & Co. It is thanks to this partnership that JP begins his real climb to the top of Wall Street. First of all, thanks to Drexel's father's contacts, JP manages to raise significant capital, which he will use to offer loans to growing American industries, making himself indispensable for the country's development. At the time, railway transportation was rapidly expanding. In the United States, JP understood the importance of seizing the moment of railway expansion and began targeting struggling companies in the sector, buying their stocks. Slowly but surely, he gained control of an increasingly large slice of the sector. Through brilliant financial operations, JP began the path that would lead him to monopolize the railway industry in the early 1900s. The period from 1870 to 1905 in America would be remembered as the Gilded Age, meaning a gilded shine. This was because during a period that was relatively prosperous, inequalities and incongruities in the economic system emerged. However, during these years, America experienced rapid growth led mainly by strong industrialization of the country, surpassing European growth by a large margin. As a result, millions of Europeans began to emigrate to America. During this period, when Junius' father died in 1890, JP, at the age of 53, took control of Junior Spencer Morgan & Co. He was already one of the most powerful men in America, and his business was booming. It was time to expand his interests in other sectors, such as the energy sector. In 1891, JP was one of the first financiers of General Electric. The company would become one of America's most important energy companies. However, the growth of the United States was interrupted in 1893, and thus JP's expansion into other sectors was halted, at least for the time being. In fact, in 1893, a severe depression hit the American economy. It all began with the collapse of two American companies, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad and the National Cordage Company. These were two large companies that employed thousands of workers, and news of their failure on the market caused panic. The problem was that many companies had heavily indebted themselves to expand their activities, and when the stock market crashed, banks began to demand repayment of loans, but many companies were unable to pay. As a result, many banks and companies failed, drowning in debt. At the same time, people began to rush to bank counters to withdraw their savings, but unfortunately, many banks had empty vaults because they had invested their money in companies that later went bankrupt. The result of the crisis was quite bitter. Over 15,000 businesses closed their doors, including 500 banks, and the unemployment rate approached 25%. The crisis also severely tested the American gold reserves. According to the Treasury Secretary, there were only $9 million left in the public coffers. The United States risked bankruptcy. At this point, J.P. Morgan approached President Grover Cleveland with an idea: a private bailout of the public. The Treasury could buy gold from him and other European bankers. Cleveland, who was in his second term, firmly believed in austerity and the gold standard. J.P. Morgan didn't like him. He believed that the crisis was difficult to manage and that companies had to make it on their own. He believed that the United States should only guarantee the dollars in circulation with gold deposits, but gold was scarce, and in fact, due to the scarcity of gold, the American Treasury, and therefore the government, was on the brink of bankruptcy. Cleveland decided to give in to J.P. Morgan's ideas. However, a different operation is required, and a special committee will buy U.S. government bonds in exchange for $62 million in gold. Therefore, it is no longer the state that buys gold from J.P. Morgan, but J.P. Morgan that buys government bonds with gold. The special committee will be formed by J.P. Morgan and the Rothschilds. It is important to remember that the Rothschilds are now international bankers who finance various governments around the world, especially the most powerful ones, so be careful with your comments. In any case, both parties agree and the plan works, so the Treasury's funds return to balance and the United States avoids the risk of bankruptcy. In a system like this, it would make sense to have a lender of last resort, that is, an entity that lends money to the government. In these years, America still does not have a central bank, that is, this type of lender. We can say that JP, during the crisis, effectively played the typical role of a central bank, but let's move on. In the early years of the 20th century, JP tried to increase its presence in the railways and enter a new sector: steel. Having control of the steel industry would have given it a huge competitive advantage in the railways. So, in 1901, after a series of acquisitions, it formed the United States Steel Corporation, which was the first company in the world to exceed $1 billion in market capitalization. This company was born from the merger of the Federal Steel Company, which was under the control of the GPS, the Carnegie Steel Company, and other small companies in the industry. With the creation of U.S. Steel, J.P. Morgan secured a dominant position in the steel industry, thus achieving the competitive advantage in the railway sector he had been seeking. Furthermore, the situation left by the 1893 crisis allowed J.P. Morgan to expand even more rapidly. In fact, the crisis had led to the bankruptcy or near bankruptcy of many railway companies, and in practice, there were bargains to be had, with previously solid companies now available at bargain prices. So in 1901, JP founded Northern Securities, together with other big players in the American railways. JP Morgan had thus conquered the monopoly of two vital sectors for the development of the American economy at the time: railways and steel. In fact, he had a power and importance in the country comparable to that of the government, but for JP, the era of monopolies was about to come to an end. Monopolies are a problem because they end up neutralizing the mechanisms of a free market and competition. Meanwhile, although there is no longer any risk of government bankruptcy, the depression that began after 1893 has not yet ended. Unemployment and poverty are at very high levels, making the former quite hot. Unions and the government are often at odds. At the height of the tensions, on September 14, 1901, President McKinney is assassinated by an anarchist steelworker, Leon Czolgosz. The unions will of course distance themselves from the act, but they will recognize its inevitability, given the social tensions of the time. After the president's assassination, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt accepts the delicate role of leader of the United States. Roosevelt, a Republican, denounces the excessive power of the big bankers and financiers in the country, and J.P. Morgan is one of the first to come under his scrutiny. It is strange to think, remembering Roosevelt's presidency, how much the Republican Party will change in the next century. Roosevelt accuses Morgan of monopolizing the railway and steel industries, using financial practices prohibited by the Sherman Act of 1890. Therefore, at Roosevelt's request, the Supreme Court dissolved Northern Securities in 1904. As a result, Northern Securities was divided into the various companies that made it up, returning to a situation of normal competition in the railway sector. U.S. Steel still exists, though, as JP and his associates managed to act in time to avoid being hit by antitrust laws. In fact, in 1903, they acted independently and split the company in two. Roosevelt forced Morgan to break up his empire, but the president would soon need his help. In 1907, another crisis broke out, known as the Bankers' Panic. The cause was the collapse of companies involved in copper extraction and processing. Financial markets suffered a severe blow, as they did in 1893, and people rushed to the bank to withdraw their money, causing many banks to collapse again. Burdened with debt, J.P. Morgan was approached by bankers, asking him to find a solution to prevent the collapse of the entire banking system. Thus, Morgan decided to convene all the most important bankers in the United States to his palace in New York. In his not-so-gentle ways, he declared that they would not leave until they had found a common solution. So after days of negotiations, the banks reached an agreement, and JP would organize a group of banks and credit institutions with three specific tasks: distributing money to the most difficult banks, acting as a guarantor to obtain foreign credit lines, and buying shares of the best listed companies that were falling. J.P. Morgan then went to Washington to discuss the plan with President Roosevelt. After some initial doubts from the president, J.P. managed to convince him, and on November 7, 1907, the rescue plan was put into action. In a few months, the crisis was overcome, and J.P. Morgan succeeded for the second time in helping the American government. This event made the American authorities realize how necessary an above-governmental entity was to deal with situations like this, and that responsibility could not be in the hands of a private citizen. And so, at the end of 1913, the Federal Reserve was founded. Initially, the Fed dealt with more or less the same operations that J.P. Morgan had organized to overcome the two crises, namely ensuring that commercial banks were no longer insolvent. We will see later that it will not be so easy. The work done by J.P. Morgan will be the model on which the U.S. Central Bank is built, at least for the initial setting. Ironically, also in 1913, a few months before, J.P. Morgan died in a hotel room in Rome. Well, you've reached the end of the video. If you are interested in learning more about similar topics, here you will find other really interesting videos from the channel. Thanks for watching this video. Click on the like button if you enjoyed it, and do not forget to subscribe in case you didn't. See you on the next one.